Michael's legs gave out, and he dropped to his knees. His son, the son he thought he had lost, the son he thought had moved on without him. Tears burned in his eyes, his chest tightening so much it hurt. How are you here?" His voice cracked, barely holding together. The boy glanced at the man standing behind him. "He found me. He helped me." Michael looked up, his vision blurred with emotion. The man gave a small nod. "I've been keeping him safe," he said simply. "But he's been waiting for you." Shock stood frozen, taking in everything. He had expected a lot of things tonight, but not this. Michael reached out, his hands trembling. His son didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around him, holding on tight. Michael buried his face into his son's shoulder, his whole body shaking. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. I thought you were gone." His son held him tighter. "I never stopped looking for you." Shock let out a slow breath, his chest heavy. He had thought tonight was about helping a man find closure. He hadn't realized it was about bringing a family back together. And just like that, everything changed. Michael held his son tightly, afraid that if he let go, this moment would disappear like a dream. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, his mind still struggling to process everything. The past few years had been filled with nothing but loss, regret, and loneliness. He had convinced himself that his son had moved on, that there was no place for him in his life anymore. But now, here he was, thin, tired, but alive, and waiting for him. Shock stood quietly, watching the reunion with a mix of emotions. He had seen a lot in his life, but this was different. This was real. This was something deeper than just a man finding shelter. It was about finding something he thought was gone forever. Michael finally pulled back slightly, holding his son's face in his hands, his fingers trembling. "How long have you been here?" he asked, his voice raw. His son glanced at the man beside them. "A while. I tried to find you. I looked everywhere. When I found out the house was still in your name, I figured maybe you'd come back someday." His voice wavered slightly, his eyes filled with emotions he had been holding in for far too long. "I didn't want to leave in case you did." Michael swallowed the lump in his throat, guilt washing over him like a wave. His son had been waiting in an empty house, surviving however he could, hoping for something Michael had almost given up on himself. The man who had been watching them finally spoke again, his tone calm but firm. "He's strong, but he shouldn't have been on his own this long." Michael wiped at his eyes and looked at the man, really seeing him for the first time. "Why did you help him?" The man gave a small shrug. "Because I've been where you are. And sometimes people need a hand before they can stand on their own again." Shock nodded slightly, understanding that more than most. Life was unpredictable. Sometimes it knocked you down so hard that getting back up didn't seem possible. But it was. And right now, Michael had a second chance in front of him, one that not everyone got. Michael took a deep breath, then turned back to his son. "I'm not leaving you again," he said, his voice steady. "I don't care what it takes. We're going to fix this. Together." His son nodded, relief flashing across his face. It wasn't going to be easy. There were still struggles ahead, but for the first time in years, they weren't alone. Shock clapped Michael on the shoulder, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Looks like you've got a home after all, bruv." Michael let out a shaky breath, glancing around the house. It wasn't just walls and a roof anymore. It was something more, something worth fighting for. As they stepped outside, the cold air didn't feel as heavy anymore. The night was still dark, but for the first time in a long time, Michael saw a way forward. And with his son beside him, he knew this was only the beginning. Shock sat down on the sidewalk beside him, ignoring the strange looks from people walking by. "So what's your story, Michael?" he asked. Michael let out a dry laugh. "You really want to know?" Shock nodded. "Yeah, I do." Michael took a deep breath, staring at the city lights in the distance. And then, for the first time in a long time, he started to talk. Michael sighed, his breath forming a small cloud in the cold night air. He stared ahead, his fingers tightening around the half-eaten protein bar, as if holding on to something fragile. "I wasn't always like this," he muttered. His voice was rough, like it hadn't been used much in a while. Shock didn't say anything. He just listened. Michael let out a small chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "I used to have a job, a home. Worked in construction. Hard work, but it paid the bills, kept me moving, kept my mind busy." His jaw tightened, the weight of memories pressing down on him. Then things changed. He didn't say how. Not yet. But Shock could see it, the way his shoulders tensed, the way his eyes seemed to drift somewhere far away. Michael rubbed his hands together for warmth. "You ever had one moment where everything just flipped? Like one bad day turns into a bad week, then a bad year. And before you know it, you don't even recognize your own life anymore." Shock nodded slowly. He didn't know that kind of struggle personally, but he understood enough to know it was real. Michael took another small bite of the protein bar. "Lost my job first. Company shut down. Said they couldn't afford to keep us on. I thought I'd find something else, but work was slow. Bills started piling up. Then my landlord raised the rent. Couldn't keep up. 1 month turned into 2, then 3. His voice dropped lower. "I tried, man, I really did. But trying don't always mean nothing when the world ain't got space for you." Shock leaned back slightly, absorbing Michael's words. He knew struggle, grew up around it, saw it firsthand. But hearing it like this, raw and unfiltered, hit different. Michael shook his head. "It's funny. You think you got friends, family, people who'll have your back. But when things get bad, they get quiet. First, they check on you. Then they stop calling. After a while, you realize you're fighting alone." He exhaled sharply. "And you don't always win." A gust of wind blew past them, rattling the empty cans near the sidewalk. The streets around them were still busy, full of life, but it all felt distant, like a world Michael no longer belonged to. Shock tapped his fingers against his knee, deep in thought. "Ain't nobody helped you?" he asked. Michael hesitated. "Some tried, but help don't always come the way you need it. Sometimes people think throwing a few dollars your way is enough, but it ain't just about money." He looked down at his hands. "It's about feeling like you still matter. Like you ain't just another face people pass by without thinking twice." Shock felt that. Too many people walked past Michael every day, barely even noticing he existed. And here he was, telling a story nobody had ever stopped to hear. Michael glanced at Shock then, studying him. "Why you even listening, man?" His tone wasn't accusing, just curious. Shock met his gaze. "Because you're talking," he said simply. Michael held his stare for a moment before looking away. He let out a breath, this time softer. "Well, I guess it don't hurt to talk for a little while." But what he didn't know was that this conversation, this one night, was about to change everything. Michael's fingers fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve, his mind lost in thought. For a while, he didn't say anything. The city moved around them, cars passing by, people laughing, music spilling from nearby shops, but it all felt distant, like background noise to something much heavier. Shock could feel the weight in the silence. He had been in plenty of conversations before, but this one was different. It wasn't about jokes or music or fame. This was real. He could see it in Michael's face, the exhaustion, the quiet pain, the years of being overlooked. Then Michael spoke again, his voice lower this time. You ever feel like you're stuck? Like no matter what you do, you're just trapped? His fingers tightened into a fist before loosening again. That's how it felt. Every day. Waking up, wondering where my next meal's coming from. Wondering if I'd even wake up at all. Shock watched him closely. There was something about the way he said that last part, like he wasn't just talking about hunger or cold nights. Michael let out a slow breath, staring down at his cart, at the scattered pieces of his life. You ever seen people cross the street just so they don't have to walk past you? Look through you like you don't exist. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. It does something to you. Makes you feel like maybe you don't exist. Like maybe you don't matter. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You do matter, bruv, he said, his voice firm. Michael shook his head. To who? Shaq didn't answer right away. He thought about all the people who had walked by tonight, too busy, too distracted, too caught up in their own lives to notice. He thought about how easy it was to pretend someone else's struggle wasn't real, just because it wasn't happening to you. Then something shifted in Michael's expression, like he had just remembered something, or maybe made a decision right then and there. His hands trembled slightly as he reached down into his cart, moving aside the old blankets and worn-out clothes. He pulled out something small, something wrapped in a cloth. His fingers hesitated over it before unwrapping it slowly. Shaq's breath hitched slightly when he saw what it was. It wasn't money. It wasn't food. It wasn't some old, forgotten possession. It was a small silver key. Michael held it up between his fingers, turning it over under the glow of a nearby streetlight. This used to open my front door, he murmured. His voice was distant, like he was speaking more to himself than to Shaq. I kept it, even after everything. Even when I had nowhere to go, nothing left. I kept it. He let out a shaky breath. I don't even know why. Shaq swallowed, feeling the tension in the air thicken. It wasn't just about the key. It was about what it meant. About the life Michael had lost. About the part of him that still hadn't let go. Michael's fingers tightened around the key. You ever hold on to something so long, even when you know it's useless? Just because letting go feels worse. Shaq didn't answer. He didn't have to. Michael exhaled, looking down at the key one last time. Then slowly he stretched out his arm, gripping it between his fingers like he was about to drop it, like he was about to let it all go. Shaq's chest tightened. His heartbeat picked up. He didn't know why, but something told him. Whatever happened next, it was going to change everything. Michael's fingers hovered over the edge of the cart, the small silver key dangling between them. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against his worn-out jacket, as if urging him to let go. His grip loosened just a little, and for a split second, it seemed like he was ready to drop it, ready to leave the last piece of his old life behind. But then, at the very last moment, his hand clenched. He pulled the key back toward him, staring at it like it held some kind of answer he couldn't quite figure out. His breathing was uneven. His eyes locked onto the tiny piece of metal, as if it carried the weight of every mistake, every loss, every moment that had led him here. Shaq noticed the change in his face. This wasn't just hesitation. This was something deeper, something heavier. Michael, he said carefully, his voice steady. What is it, bruv? Michael swallowed hard, shaking his head. I can't, he muttered under his breath. I can't just let it go. His fingers gripped the key so tightly now that his knuckles turned white. Shaq leaned in, watching him closely. Why? He asked. What's really keeping you holding on to it? Michael's jaw clenched. He looked around, as if making sure no one else was listening, then took a shaky breath. Because the house, it's still there. Shock frowned slightly, confused. What do you mean? I thought. I mean it's still mine, Michael cut in, his voice low. Legally. On paper. I never sold it. Never lost it to the bank. I just walked away. He let out a weak chuckle, shaking his head at himself. I left before they could take it. Before I had to see it empty. Before I had to watch it become something that wasn't mine anymore. Shock felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just about losing a home. Michael had been carrying the weight of this choice for years. A house still standing, waiting, abandoned, yet still his. Michael exhaled, his hands gripping his knees. You don't get it, man. If I go back, if I see it now, after everything, I don't know if I can handle it. His voice cracked slightly, the vulnerability breaking through despite his best efforts to hold it back. Shock stayed silent for a second, letting the words settle. He could see it now, the real conflict, the real thing that had been keeping Michael stuck. It wasn't just about survival. It was about the past, about facing what was left. Then Michael's eyes darted up suddenly, a flicker of something else passing through them. Fear. Shock noticed immediately. What is it? Michael hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. I'm not the only one who knows it's empty. Shock's stomach tightened. Who? Michael's hands fidgeted again, his voice dropping lower. Some people, they've been watching it, waiting. I think they know I still got the key. He swallowed hard. And I don't think they're planning to wait much longer. The cold wind whispered through the busy streets, carrying the distant sounds of honking cars and hurried footsteps. People rushed past, wrapped in thick coats, lost in their own worlds. But in the middle of all this movement, one man sat still. A tattered shopping cart beside him held everything he owned, some old blankets, a worn-out jacket, and a few scattered belongings. His face, lined with hardship, told a silent story of struggles no one cared to hear. As the city pulsed with life, a tall figure walked down the sidewalk, his heavy boots crunching against the pavement. Dressed in a hoodie and a thick chain around his neck, his presence alone made heads turn. It was Big Shock. Known for his humor, energy, and viral fame, people often saw him as the guy who made them laugh. But tonight was different. His eyes weren't scanning for fans or cameras. He was just walking, lost in his own thoughts, until he noticed the man sitting in the cart. Something about him made Shock slow down. Maybe it was the way the man stared blankly ahead, like he had given up. Maybe it was the fact that everyone else walked past him like he was invisible. Shock stopped a few steps away, watching as the man shivered, pulling his thin coat tighter around himself. A feeling stirred inside him, something deep, something he couldn't ignore. For a moment he hesitated. Should he just keep walking? He had places to be, things to do. But as he looked at the man again, he knew. This wasn't just another face in the crowd. This was a human being, struggling, suffering, forgotten. Shock took a deep breath and stepped forward. The man barely noticed at first, but then his tired eyes flickered upward. There was something in them, surprise, maybe even a little fear. People didn't usually stop. People didn't usually care. Shock didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, looking at the man, taking in the moment. The city around them kept moving, but for the two of them, time seemed to slow down. Finally, Shock reached into his pocket, but it wasn't for what anyone might expect. What happened next left everyone speechless. The man in the cart shifted uncomfortably, his wary eyes fixed on Shock's hand as it reached into his pocket. He had seen this before. People pretending to help, only to toss a few coins his way without even looking at him. He had learned not to expect much from anyone. But Chuck wasn't pulling out money. Instead, he crouched down to the man's level, his breath visible in the cold air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city around them kept moving, cars zooming past, people talking on their phones, laughing with friends, caught up in their own lives. But here, in this small pocket of time, it was just the two of them. Shaq finally broke the silence. "What's your name, bruv?" His voice was softer than usual, not the loud, animated energy people knew him for. The man hesitated. He wasn't used to being asked that. Most people didn't even look him in the eye, let alone care about his name. His lips were dry, cracked from the cold, but he managed to mumble, "Michael." Shock nodded, as if he were committing the name to memory. "Michael," he repeated. "How long you been out here?" Michael looked down at his hands, rough and dirty, the lines on his palms like a map of everything he had been through. "A while," he said simply. There was no point in giving details. It wasn't a story people wanted to hear. But Shaq wasn't just anybody. He could see there was more to Michael than what met the eye. His clothes were torn, his shoes barely holding together, but his face had the look of someone who had seen better days. Someone who once had dreams, plans, maybe even a family. Shaq glanced at the cart beside him, filled with scraps of a life that once was. A book with torn pages, a broken radio, a picture frame with no photo inside. Each item told a story, but Michael wasn't offering any of them. Shaq reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out something small. A protein bar. He unwrapped it halfway and held it out. "Here, eat this," he said. Michael eyed it for a second, then shook his head. "I'm good," he muttered. Shaq didn't pull his hand back. "Come on, man. Just take it." After a moment, Michael sighed and took the bar, breaking off a small piece, like he wasn't sure if he should save the rest for later. He chewed slowly, his tired eyes flickering with something that wasn't quite gratitude, but wasn't rejection either. Shaq sat up straighter, his mind racing. This wasn't just about a homeless man and an old key anymore. This was something else, something bigger. Michael glanced around nervously, then leaned in. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq stared at him for a long moment. Then, without hesitation, he said, "Let's go see your house." Michael's breath hitched slightly, his eyes widening. "What?" Shaq stood up, brushing off his hoodie. "If there's something going on, we can't just sit here, bruv." He looked down at Michael, his expression firm. "You got the key. Let's see what's waiting for you." Michael's hands trembled slightly as he looked at the key again. A storm of emotions passed through his face. Fear, uncertainty, something else Shaq couldn't quite name. And then, finally, he nodded. But neither of them had any idea what they were about to walk into. Michael's hands shook as he turned the key over in his fingers, his mind racing. He never thought he'd go back. Never thought he'd see that place again. But now, standing here with Shaq beside him, it didn't feel like a choice anymore. It felt like something he had to face. The two of them walked through the quiet streets, the cold pressing in around them. Michael led the way, his pace slow, hesitant, as if every step was pulling him deeper into something he wasn't ready for. Shaq stayed close, his eyes scanning the streets, alert. Something about this whole situation didn't sit right with him. After a long, silent walk, they finally reached the house. It stood at the end of the block, dark and lifeless, the porch light long burned out. The windows were dusty, the yard overgrown. It looked exactly the way Michael had left it, except for one thing. The front door was slightly open. Michael froze. His breathing hitched, his fingers tightening around the key. "It wasn't like that when I left," he whispered. Shaq stepped forward, his muscles tensing. "Stay close, bruv." They moved up the porch steps carefully, the old wood creaking under their weight. Shaq pushed the door open wider, revealing the dimly lit interior. The air was stale, thick with dust, but there were footprints in the dirt on the floor, fresh ones. Someone had been here. Michael swallowed hard and stepped inside, his eyes darting around the familiar space. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets. Old pictures still hung on the walls, faded and forgotten. It was like a time capsule of a life he had abandoned. Then from the back of the house, a noise. A rustling. Shaq's head snapped in that direction. Someone's here. Michael's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Then, before he could react, a shadow shifted in the hallway. A man stepped forward. Tall, broad shoulders. His clothes were worn, his face rough, but his eyes were sharp, focused. He looked at Michael, then at Shaq, his expression unreadable. Michael's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer right away. He took a slow step forward, his hands loose at his sides, calm but deliberate. Then he spoke. "I was waiting for you." Michael's stomach twisted. "Why?" The man tilted his head slightly, studying him. "Because this house, it wasn't empty." A chill ran down Michael's spine. "What do you mean?" The man exhaled slowly, then nodded toward the back room. "You should see for yourself." Michael's feet felt like they were made of lead, but he forced himself to move. Shaq stayed close beside him as they walked down the hallway, the air growing heavier with each step. When they reached the last door, the man pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark, but in the faint light from the window, Michael saw it. A small sleeping bag in the corner. A few scattered belongings. An empty food container. Someone had been living here. Michael's throat tightened. Who? Then from the shadows, a quiet voice. "Dad?" Michael's entire body went still. His breath caught. He turned sharply toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs. And then, out of the darkness, stepped a boy. Thin, wrapped in an oversized hoodie. His face was tired, his eyes cautious but familiar. Michael staggered back. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. No, that's not. It can't be. The boy took another step forward, the dim light catching his face. "It's me, Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper.